Hi, everyone. So today is going to be a bit different. I am joined by Kenidi, a CPSI fellow.
Hi, Rasheed.
And also Akil, CPSI operations manager.
Hello.
And we are going to be discussing a different topic. We're discussing music, but specifically Caribbean Calypso music in the genre of social commentary.
So come to the Caribbean with us.
Yeah, and I feel like social commentary really gives you the feel of the Caribbean people, and we're going to explore some economics through feelings, and that has to be new.
And it's actually a real genre called social commentary. It's not like a description per se, although it is.
We didn't make it up.
We didn't make it up. And I like it because social commentary is essentially a mirror to Caribbean politics and Caribbean economics and Caribbean general sentiment. And it's a very underutilized theme when it comes to social science research and, of course, policy conversation. So this is my attempt, or our attempt, essentially, to have that kind of conversation.
Also, I feel like social commentary is educational in this way that people who might not usually seek out that information, they are exposed to it and they know what's up and they have an opinion about what is going on in the society at the time. So I think it bridges the gap even without us doing it.
That's right. We're going to discuss 3 songs. The first one being The Sinking Ship by Gypsy. Next one being IMF Takeover by Iley. And the third one being Federation by the Mighty Sparrow. Those 3 songs are going to give a whirlwind of conversation. I hope we're going to enjoy it. I think we will. And we'll see you on the other side.
Yeah, let's go.
So the first song we're going to discuss is called The Sinking Ship by a Calypsonian named Gypsy. And just for context, in Calypso, usually the singers have stage names. That's usually what people refer to them as. So this particular singer, who's from Trinidad and Tobago, his stage name was Gypsy, and this is his song.
The Trinidad, a luxury liner, sailing the Caribbean Sea with an old captain named Eric Williams. For years, sailed smooth and free, but sadly Eric Williams passed away. The ship hit rough water that day. Someone turned the bridge over to a captain named Chambers. Me blood crawl, things start to fall. Hold me head when I sail a ball. Captain, this ship is sinking.
And we're back. So, Kenidi, Akil, just before we get to the discussion points, what is your impression of this song, Kenidi?
So I really love this song, but there's something that I think adds some context about Gypsy. Gypsy actually went on to become a politician. And I feel like that is really relevant. And I feel like he started by complaining and then he was, I will do something about it. And I really enjoyed that. And I think that the song, as it relates to the sentiments of Caribbean people always think the ship is sinking. They're always mad at the government. And I'm sure that, to my understanding, the song was very successful because Caribbean people always feel this way.
That is true. And this was released in 1986, just to say that again. Akil, what's your first impression of the song?
I love the metaphor. I love the metaphor. The level of knowledge he has to have about boats, first of all. I realize a lot of the younger singer today, if I'm a singer, but we aren't as knowledgeable as we were before. And this speaks volumes. These old Calypso songs, all 3 of them that we are going to listen to, they do speak volumes in it. The vast knowledge these singers had. And some of them still have, because some of them are still alive.
Yes.
So I love the metaphor. It makes knowledge fun to learn.
Absolutely. But also, I really don't think they're random at all because I feel like it paints a picture. Like you start with Gypsy and then we get into the other songs, which we have not introduced yet. But when you get into the other songs, I really feel like they continue his sentiment, but you also can see how things declined because they tell you right there in the music.
Didn't this song come out in 1982?
82?
I think 1982 it came out.
Okay.
Which is a year after Eric Williams died.
Yes.
Hence why he referenced.
Right.
He
Could
died
be 82. Okay.
And turned the bridges over to Chambers.
Yes. Okay. Let's get into this. The song is plain to see the economy of Trinidad, when he wrote the song, in his view, just declined as the ship is literally sinking in the ocean. So he starts off saying the Trinidad, that's his name for the ship he's talking about, a luxury liner sailing the Caribbean Sea with an old captain named Eric Williams. For years, sailed smooth and free. But sadly, Eric Williams passed away. The ship hit rough water that day. Someone turned that bridge over to the captain named Chambers. Me blood crawl. Things start to fall. Hold me head when a sailor ball. Okay, now this paragraph or this verse has a lot in it. And the most important part to remember is the two major people he mentioned in the verse. Eric Williams and George Chambers.
Correct.
So Eric Williams is very well known internationally. He's probably the only Caribbean politician that has an international representation in many places, but not actually because of politics. So Eric Williams is primarily known in economics policy conversations as an economic historian because of his book called Capitalism and Slavery. Very, very influential book. It was based off of his PhD dissertation at Oxford. This is the book where he essentially makes the argument that the primary reason, or at least a primary reason that is under-acknowledged for the abolition of slavery was the economic factors. It became not as profitable, I'm going to make a very crude argument here, but not as profitable to keep the slaves anymore. So that really pushed the British Empire to abolish slavery faster. That was a core thesis.
Has to be it.
It's not. It's a very bad argument, but that's not.
You'll have to tell me. You'll have to tell me why it's bad, because my public sentiment is on his side.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that topic now because there's like literally decades and decades and decades of research about why a lot of the core things in it is incorrect. But you are correct in the sense that that is a very common sentiment in the Caribbean, that thesis is correct. And that has led a lot of different conversations in the Caribbean. Essentially, one of the biggest impacts is the whole reparations movement and all the academics behind that and the political center behind that and the political movement behind that. It's a whole thing in the Caribbean that's actually not well known outside the Caribbean. In any case, that is the Eric Williams that is very popular in the world, at least in the academic world.
And just to plug in, you mentioned this in your podcast with Anton Howes.
I did, yes. My recent released podcast with Anton, that's correct. So that's the Eric Williams. He was the first prime minister of Trinidad. The very first. He was the last premier. First and last.
Yes, and that was lasted for like 10 years.
Yes.
And then he was prime minister for like roughly 20 years, hence why Gypsy mentioned 30 years.
Exactly.
The ship was going good.
Exactly.
Now there's a lot of fingers pointing, suspicion running strong. Who's to be blamed for all her failures? Who's to be blamed for doing her wrong? Now please remember, I'm warning you, for 30 years she had the same crew who hold the keys to her fault. So we know who's at fault. Now it's up to you, it's up to me to make her worthy to go back to sea. Captain, this ship is sinking.
So Trinidad, as a former British colony in the West Indies, what we could now call the Caribbean, was going through a independence movement in many ways. This is kind of a general thing that's happening in the world in late 50s, early 60s. And the first attempt the Caribbean was doing towards this movement away from the empire fully engaged was the British West Indies Federation. This was essentially a unit of one large Caribbean state made up of smaller countries with one government, one parliament, so on and so on. And that was actually supposed to be under the crown, actually essentially like Australia and Canada, same idea. Actually, the constitution of the West Indies Federation was based on the Australian constitution also. So that was his sentiment. And Eric Williams was in that group of people who was in favor of it. Him in Trinidad, had Granny Adams in Barbados, you had Manley in Jamaica, and so on and so on. You had Cipriani in Grenada, various things like that. So that was the sentiment. However, the Federation failed, which we will discuss in a song on this episode too. The Federation failed, and the smaller countries, or all the countries, decided to go towards independence. And Trinidad went towards independence in 1962. So Eric Williams, who was the premier, he was the chief minister, then the premier, then after independence, now becomes the first prime minister. He held that post for 20-some years until he died.
Over a span of 20 years, but 18 years and 205 days, I think, is to be specific.
Yes. And he was really seen as a very forward-thinking prime minister, which is in many ways ironic because, again, when you think of him academically, you wouldn't get that sense that he's actually very much pro-capitalist reform in many ways, but that's a different conversation altogether in some ways. So that's Eric Williams. He passed away, and the sentiment was really that he was the right leader at the time. He was doing things correct. He passed away. And then the person that came after him, George Chambers, became prime minister, but unfortunately, he wasn't seen in a very good light, not necessarily because of his fault. In many ways, he did do many bad policies and didn't lead correctly, sure, but at that time also there was some really massive global economic shocks, oil shocks and so on that happened in the economy. And him being not the best leader, essentially, didn't prevail over all these external forces, and therefore it actually really pushed the economy to a very, very low level. And it was a really bad sentiment in the country, and that actually led to a lot of turmoil in the country, strikes, and IMF programs actually were taken up. That caused a big issue in the country as well, which we will actually discuss IMF song too in a few minutes. And all of that kind of really build, and that was why the sentiment was not good. And a lot of people say, well, if Williams was here, then we, Trinidadians, would have been in a better position. And that's really essentially the sentiment here in this song.
I feel like that's really hard on the new Chambers. I feel like that's really hard on Chambers because there was a coup. But no. The coup was later, but I feel when you review a person's work holistically, I feel like the work of prime ministers is reviewed over the time they've served. A coup is a big deal. How, of course, that's going to have
but the coup
an
happened
impact.
After he was out of power, though. It was under Robinson. The coup happened under Robinson in 1990.
Mm-hmm. So it was not him then?
No, it's not. It was the government that came after his government.
Okay.
But see, the coup is a good crystallization of really how bad it was in Trinidad when Chambers kind of really came into power and had to lead the country. Because the coup, for those that are not aware, there's probably most people listening to this conversation, the Jamaat al-Muslimin coup attempt in Trinidad since July 1990 was much a crystallization of these issues. So essentially it was a group of radical Islamists, or Muslims, as we kind of say in the Caribbean now, who had a coup. They took over parliament, the Red House. It's called Red House of Trinidad. They took over Red House. They essentially imprisoned or captured the prime minister and so on in the government house. In the morning time, they bombed the police station. Various things like that. A bunch of people died.
They held them hostage for 6 days as well. It wasn't short.
So they had the IMF program, they had all the layoffs. The government under Robinson, who came after Chambers, was implementing many, many austerity programs, and it was really tough in the country. That's the culmination of the coup, which we will probably get to in the future, maybe. Who knows if we do this again. And that was the issue in the song. It's like, hey, should I actually leave the ship? Should I stay in Trinidad or should I migrate? Obviously, leadership usually means to migrate to UK or Bronx, New York or Toronto. And that was the baseline there.
I just researched and I realized it did come out in 1986, the song.
Okay.
Which is also when George Chambers finished his first term.
Right.
I wonder if the song influenced him to not have a second term.
Well, no, because what happens, if I remember correctly, with the election, his next election, his party, because of all these external shocks, or massive shocks that happened in 1980s, the party, the PNM, People's National Movement, Eric Williams' party, he lost. It was the most substantial loss that party ever had in its existence.
Wow.
Yes. And that's what came into the new party now, which Robinson was the prime minister. So that was the issue. So he really had a big shock, all these shocks to manage, and he didn't manage properly. And people were obviously rightfully, in many ways, blaming him for that.
Yeah, they got 33 of the 36 seats because they were super done. They were done like Barbados was done.
Right. It's a very strong parallel to Barbados' election in 2018. Is it 18? No. Yes, 18.
Yes, 2018.
When the current Prime Minister, Mia Moore-Motley, her party, the Barbados Labour Party, defeated the Democratic Labour Party to win 30 out of 30 seats, right?
Correct.
Yes. It was all. It was all. That's right. It was all.
Yeah. Caribbean does have that weird tendency, just like all or nothing after these like external shocks. And we see it repeated over time. Happened in Grenada also as well. Also some things as well. I think Dominica had a similar issue for some time. So yeah, this is a common trend in the Caribbean. It didn't start with me and it won't end with her either, unfortunately. So this song to me is really good because it really reflects this issue.
Surpassed, and in her day she sailed majestically. There were few in her class. Faithfully she fulfilled her sailor's need. Some were overpowered by greed, and so they pilfered slow. Some took by bulk and go. Now she looked dull, she's at a lull. She could barely sit on her hull. Captain, the ship is sinking.
He's singing praises for Trinidad. So Trinidad, oh, she was a beauty with wealth that few surpassed. And in her day, she sailed majestically. There were few in her class. That's the kind of thing. It was a very warm, embracing, prideful, optimistic sentiment, essentially, in Trinidad and many Caribbean countries after independence. And the first parties essentially were coming to build the nation, doing nation building. And then over time, that really dissolved as stagnation hit in, as the real trouble of being independent countries really hit forward. They were not able to continue the growth patterns. And even the song really reflects that. But now, Captain, this ship is sinking.
Yeah, but that's the human condition. People show up, they're like, this is this new thing. It's amazing. It's going to be great. And then it's hard because that's just how life is. Anything that's worth doing is hard. And I think that Caribbean people we have high standards and we expect them to be met. And we are often upset with what governments we were hopeful for have managed to actually produce. But they're trying. And it means something like someone has to try. You try and try so many times before you succeed. Someone has to try.
I mean, I agree that someone has to try. But the problem that happens, I think Trinidad, this song is a very good example, is that the things that were tried were not credible policies. So even after the troubles got worse and worse, when they, for example, went to enter the IMF program, they devalued the Trinidadian dollar. They had very harsh austerity in ways that were not productive necessarily. And those policies, which may have seemed correct in the textbook, were never really correct for the Caribbean. And it's curious because people like Williams and Manley and even Barrow and Barbados actually were against many of these policies from very early on. And only after that crop of statesmen left the state, built, so they retired or died or lost power, these more brittle policies became the norm. And we never recovered from that in many, many ways. And you're seeing even these things still getting perpetuated today. Now, the devaluation, the dollar, Trinidad, it's a very good example. That's still happening in many countries. And people think it'll go work this time. Maybe this time will work, Candy, but you know.
Has the devaluing of the dollar ever been beneficial? Why do they keep doing it?
That's a great question, Candy.
Okay. So you're telling me that all of the people who sit around and they're like, we fix and assist economies, and they keep devaluing dollars, even though it has worked 0 times.
Yes.
That's madness.
That's why Barbados, and this is probably a good way to transition to the next IMF song, Barbados refused to devalue the currency back in 1990, 1991, 92, when we had our own economic crisis, right on the heels of Trinidad, because, you know, they were having it cool, and we having our crisis too. It's all kind of rumbling in Caribbean. We refused. The central bank technocrats and the government refused the IMF of devaluing the currency, and the negotiations actually went on for a year. It was that harsh, essentially that adamant. I actually spoke to the Dr. Warrow, who was in the bank at the time in the room with the IMF during the negotiations. He said, yeah, they were adamant that we need to devalue the currency. He said, we won't do it. And they refused to give money. But what happened was that eventually they won their position. And instead of devaluing the currency, what they did was called fiscal consolidation, which is they reduced the fiscal expenses, which we will get into after we hear the first part of the next song.
We were warned, but we didn't take it. Now the money gone. Get us hell you run. Put this blessed land straight in the IMF hand. Now it is plain to see trouble in the country, cause when they hold you and they squeeze you, there is nothing you can do. Oh mama, look what the devil do. IMF take over. Trinidad and Jamaica too. IMF take over. They only aim is to devalue. IMF take over. They don't care about me and you. IMF take over. They got we by we throat. We hanging on a rope. I wonder when I go recover, cause the IMF take over.
And that was our second song, IMF Takeover, or IMF Takeover. I'm slipping to Bajan by Iley, who is a Barbadian Calypsonian. And I referenced this song in my Substack called Notes Towards Caribbean Dollarization Part 1 because it really, really encapsulates that social sentiment of the economic pressure that comes from the IMF in the Caribbean. You know, a lot of blame is given towards the IMF and their policies, but oftentimes a lot of it is well-deserved. A lot of times also Caribbean governments that deserve blame, and as we see in Calypso, they get the blame too. So the IMF song, before I kind of get into, I guess, my discussion of it, what's your first impression of this, Akil?
From someone who lived in Barbados specifically, not the entire, I didn't live in the entire Caribbean. For someone who lived in Barbados specifically, and hearing anytime someone mentions IMF, the locals, we just hate to hear it. Our immediate answer is just no, no, no. Referencing the IMF as the devil in this song is just iconic to me because I feel like that's what it's viewed at. Even growing up, it just feels that way from the adults. When you're growing up, you just hear IMF. No, we can't go there. If you go there, we're done for. We might as well all leave the country.
Yes.
I feel like this song definitely represents the people within the independent Caribbean countries.
And Kenidi?
So the part that he references about the devil, that is my favorite part of the song. Caribbean people love to be like, that's the work of the devil. This is devil work. But at the same time, I am Iley in the sense that I too want to know, did no one think about this? Because I feel it's a part of the song where he's really saying no one in the government could have really used their brain to think about the impact of the IMF, the programs they were putting in place. And because just like when I asked you, has devaluing the dollar ever worked? And you say no. I feel like Iley is saying this never works, but you're doing it anyway because you don't think about anything except yourself with reference to the politicians. And I feel like that's his perspective at that point. Also, I love how groovy it is. Like there's a song that you can move to this song. And I love that too.
Yes, it's a really good song as a song in the Calypso. As we were playing it in the background here, I'm seeing both you and Akil just dancing in your seats. You can't help it. It's really good. Any Caribbean person hears those moments like, oh, this is proper Calypso.
It's good.
Yes. This song is good on both levels. I've actually sung qua song and then sung as social commentary. Literally, it's called a social commentary song. This is a very interesting issue and period in Barbados this time, which is unfortunately not well known amongst people in our age group. But I remember when I was young, I was maybe 9 or 8, around that age group. And my parents were not together. My mom raised me, my dad was separate. And I remember one time my dad just came to my house and gave my mother a lot of money. And I asked the mother afterwards, why did that happen? And she told me, well, years ago, the government cut the public sector wages by a lot of money. And she had to help my dad a lot at the time. And he promised that when the government gives back some money, he will give her back some more money. So now they're not together many years later. But he did it anyway. And that was what happened. Because back in 1992, 93, they said the solution to the impact between the IMF and Barbados government was that they were going to cut fiscal spend. They will not devalue the currency. They will cut fiscal spend. And by doing that, they lay off some public sector workers. But what they did bigger than that was to reduce the salaries of the entire majority of the public sector at the time. And that was the way how they reduced the government expenses and kind of get back to a more fiscally sound position. But that was the solution. They said, we will not do a monetary solution. We will do a fiscal solution because that's the only way to really do it. Again, after years of negotiations and so on.
And removing devaluation off the table.
Correct. They were able to get that passed. Yeah, that's through essentially negotiation. It was a very tough time, but they did fiscal consolidation. They refused to do demonetary. Also, to this day, we still have that 2-to-1 exchange rate.
What do you think about that measure? What do you think of the value of that measure?
Well, I think it was correct. The problem, this is the issue here. The prime minister at the time was Erskine Sandiford. Mm-hmm. I think he knew that this was going to be a toxic thing to take on as the prime minister. However, he still did it. He said, I will sacrifice myself to make sure this happens.
That's how I believe politicians are supposed to behave. I think that you should serve as Christ served. It's for the people. You're there to make a difference, and your public reputation, your seat should come after that. And I know that I'm very idealist, but that's what I think they should be doing.
It is idealist, but it's not, I think, incorrect. So he knew that was going to happen, and he was right. The next election, I'm just checking here, the sequence of events here in the timeline. So, yeah, Erskine Sandiford was prime minister for 4 years or so. He wasn't able to have a very long term because he lost. He was prime minister from, I'd say a long time. So, right, it's DLP. So, right after that decision was made, he had an election coming out. He lost power to Owen Arthur. He didn't get any benefit from that. He lost power, and the DLP, who was his party, DLP party, lost power. As we know, Owen Arthur was in power for almost 15 years after that.
So my childhood political memory with reference to that prime minister, he was always widely praised in my family, actually, because the value of the Barbadian dollar is as important to Bajan as beaches never being private. We care about that. And Bajans are very proud about that. And I know that. I feel it's a worldwide knowing that Bajans are proud people. Bajans are. I'm glad he did it. I'm glad he cared. Owen Arthur, I guess, was able to then build on what he did because Owen Arthur was wrong. That's another childhood memory. I feel like he was in power my whole childhood.
Yeah, he was. He was. He was in power from 94 until...
Yeah, that's my...
2008. He left power. He lost to David Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the IMF sound. The IMF, it reflects the sentiment. So while it was absolutely necessary to borrow at that time from the IMF, obviously the conditions they initially wanted were not sound, in my opinion, and many people's opinion also. But it was a necessary condition because at the time, again, many things happen in the country, dual forces. You have all these external things happening that shock the system. You have the internal things happening where the government wasn't as pushing competitiveness as they should. So those, the economy lagged and so on. Foreign exchange position was very low at the height or the depth of the crisis. The central bank only had around $10 million left. We were on the precipice, literally. So it was completely necessary. That's all true. When Rasheed is singing this song about going to the IMF, again, he's not by any means wrong. It's just that, let's say, putting the IMF as the devil is harsh.
A bit harsh.
It's a bit harsh. It's not harsh in, let's say, every respect, but in the sense of a lot of the blame should have actually been placed on the government. They should take a lot of the blame, but they didn't get enough. They got some. Of course, they got some. They lost power, all kind of things. They got a lot of blame, but not enough. And this, to me, is too often a reflection of how the blame mostly goes on external parts like US or the World Bank or IMF or some other outside party, not enough on the problems that the government in the country does. Yes, this is wrong. The IMF does push devaluation and these other unsound policies, but oftentimes Barbados in this instance was an exception. But I said Trinidad agree with it, Jamaica agree with it, Guyana agree with it. The government also has bad ideas of policy management. So they also have hand-in-hand holding the IMF to do the devaluations unilaterally. So that's also why. There's only the case where Barbados resisted, and that's definitely should be praised for, but they have other issues at play as well.
Just want to note that the political parties or whoever may be pushing this side of the story, that is the IMF's fault, not ours. We did everything we could.
Yes, that's a good point. It is a very common thing in the Caribbean, I would say at least recently, to externalize your problems and not internalize them. So even now, when we have the current Prime Minister of Barbados in her, let's say, roadshow of global climate finance, always says, you people out there in Europe and the US and Canada who need to give us money to do stuff with climate change because you guys did this and this and this and this. Okay, fine. And we, our lowly third world Barbados selves, cannot borrow money properly. That's the speech. It's not true. It's not true. Barbados cannot borrow money in the international market because Barbados has bad account management. That's all it is. And she does not fix the issues at home in Barbados, but she goes on the international stage and complains that we can't borrow money for this and this and this. It is this externalization of problems that we need to resist. But it's difficult to resist something so seductive. It's easy.
Isn't it trying to say we're in a state of need and so we can get funding? Because my understanding, if we are in a certain position as a third world country and we don't lack enough direction or lack enough funds or lack something, then we can be approved for funding.
That's right. That's the whole concessionary loans conversation, whereas we should be able to get cheap, meaning low interest rate loans from international multilateral agencies and so on. As that's the thing she's pitching.
And to meet those requirements, we have to market ourselves as someone who needs these things.
And
place ourselves in these positions.
That's right.
To need these things rather than saying we're above these requirements. Those things are below us in a sense. We are higher, so we need to aim higher, but they keep going low. So is it correct term? Prophecy? Fulfillment? Is it?
No, see, it's
self-fulfilling prophecies.
In either way, what the Motley administration has, I will say, beautifully done. I mean, beautiful as a aesthetic criteria, not like a moral criteria in this case, as a political stuff, because she has masterfully structured the conversation in a very unique way. Barbados and most of the Caribbean, it's not all, Haiti being an exception and so on, doesn't really fall in the criteria of poor country anymore. That's good. We succeeded in many things. We shouldn't be wanting to be poor. Fine. So we don't qualify for concessionary loans. Easy to get. They're less due diligence, essentially. They have longer term paybacks. They have very cheap interest rates. They're fun-loving loans. We don't qualify anymore. So what she did, she changed the vulnerability conversation to climate change. We are very vulnerable to climate change. We are, in many ways, but not actually in a way that prevents us from borrowing money. And because of that, the vulnerability criteria is now shifted. The goalposts have shifted. But that's the magical stroke she did. And now the entire world's like, we need proper climate finance funding. Well, the whole Bridgetown initiative is now coming into a better version of first world to third world funding. Of course, we don't use those terms anymore, but that's what it is. And that is a magical transformation in the concessionary loan conversation that Mia Motley has really, really pushed and should take credit for as a successful of her campaign for that thing. My, however, concern is that was unnecessary because the real issue, because Caribbean countries are actually very, very small. That means we can borrow money infinitely in the sense that the money we need to borrow is always available to be loaned to us because there are things that can be done because we're very small. The problem is though this, when you borrow money, you have to actually use it somewhere. The money has to return to the investor. This is in real markets, normal market activity. So if you borrow money to build something, the thing has to be built and it has to be managed and it has revenue and so on and so on. So the problem with borrowing money in Caribbean is that there's a lack of competitive projects available and made available by the government and by the ministries and various market factors to actually take in the money. So even when you borrow all these concessionary loans from the Green Climate Fund or the UN and so on, where is the money going to go? The lack of projects, lack of actual proper management of strategies, lack of implementation, these things are actually big problems that the governments refuse, because it's not in their best interest to have real plans. They refuse to really think this through. And people in the international community have been falling for it hook and center. They've been praising all these models of this and that. And I'm like, well, at home, we still haven't had an audit of the Treasury in 20 some years. So you're going to give us money and going to go into a black hole. That's okay, I guess.
With tunnel vision, you only see straight ahead. But if it's open, you will see all around instead. It is plain to see that those who lead we are as blind as a bat. Can't tell a shoe from a hat. And we must
So do countries that are still under the French, under the Dutch, under British rule, do they have any reason to go to IMF? I don't believe so.
They don't. Actually, one very good example I saw is recently, during the height of COVID, when Barbados was struggling to do everything. Height of COVID, essentially. Had to borrow some more money and kind of things from different IMF and CDB and so on. Bermuda was able to borrow $1 billion in the international market.
Why? How come? What were they doing that was different?
Had good management of the economy. They had actual projects say, hey, the money goes here, returns this, the money goes here, returns that. Like our good returns in the last 20 years, 10 years. They have good public sector management, good experts, good technocrats. They were in a good position. They're smaller than us also. So the thing is that when you don't have the real public sector and the competitive advantage to doing good projects, you are at a loss. So you have to then complain on the global stage to essentially beg for money for cheap instead of arranging your fiscal priorities and capacity in a way to take in the money properly. So Bermuda versus Barbados is a very good example of that different path taken. But yet, one is independent and one is not an independent country. And people say, oh, well, these independent countries, they have all the power, but they have no actual plans.
Okay, but I think the part where independent countries are struggling more is obvious. That doesn't seem a complex thing to me. It seems like an obvious result of just the country's histories and who's taking responsibility for them, and the fact that the country didn't have to build its government infrastructure from scratch. A bigger infrastructure assist in the functioning of theirs in some way or another, even if it's predominantly managed at home. I feel like those things are relevant. I know you'll probably want to tell me they're not.
They're not, actually, because this is a good transition to our third song.
People want to know why Jamaica run from the Federation. Well, they want to know why Jamaica run away from the Federation. Jamaica have a right to speak your mind. That is my opinion. And if you believe in democracy, you'll agree with me. But if they know they didn't want federation, and they know they don't want to unite as one, independence was at the door. Why didn't they speak before? This is no time to say you are federating no more.
And we're back. So the third song is one of my favorite songs because it discusses, I think, one of the most important issues in the last century in the Caribbean, which is the failure of the British West Indies Federation. I will probably have to give some context here. So the Federation was an attempt of many of the Caribbean countries, British Empire countries, to form a new country under one government. I think I mentioned this earlier, one government, and that government would be under the crown. So it's similar to how Canada, the Canadian colonies, formed one country called Canada. The Australian colonies formed one country called Australia. The Caribbean colonies were going to form one country called the British West Indies Federation. That was the idea. And the idea was, it was seen as absurd that small countries that had less than 200,000 people should exist as independent states. It was seen as completely ineffectual. You couldn't have proper civil services. You couldn't have proper policy implementation strategies. You couldn't have good talent creation. It was too small, too limited, and had very low capacity to get better. That was really the driving force. And there are people like Eric Williams, who we mentioned in the first song. He was much in favor of federation for these same reasons. So that was the idea. But the federation only lasted 4 years. It lasted from 1958 officially to 1962 officially. And Jamaica, under Bustamante, who's the prime minister, he was essentially a politician, pushed for Jamaica to have a referendum to either leave or stay in the federation. So to leave or stay. And the country voted to leave, very Brexit-like, leave the federation. And when Eric Williams saw that happened, he is like, oh no, we Trinidad, we are legally going to leave too. Because he has a very famous line, 1 from 10 equals not 0. 1 from 10 equals 0. And if Jamaica pulled out, and they did, Trinidad would be only account for 70% of the budget and various things like that. Because Trinidad also was the capital of the Federation, Chagaramas, and so on. So Williams also pulled Trinidad out of the Federation as well and went towards direct independence. Jamaica also went right towards direct independence. And then each country in the Caribbean after that went towards direct independence, except some of the countries like the Cayman Islands, Anguilla, Bermuda, so on. They said, no, we're going to stay as territories of the UK because that makes more sense. That's what happened.
And that's quite interesting. I want to know because I only realized recently that Cayman Islands and Turks and Caicos were a part of Jamaica at that point in time.
That's right. So we are not coming you guys. We're going to stay here. We're going to stay here.
And so the Federation ended in 1962, January, and in August, the beginning of August, Jamaica got their independence, and Trinidad followed at the end of August.
That's right.
And got that. And Barbados, we lagged a bit. We came 4 years after.
That's right.
4 years.
And then many came after that too.
Did we want to stay?
After those left, there was still like an Eastern Caribbean thing happening. So actually, the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union was actually based in Barbados before. Because we were in that currency union also.
I did not know that part.
Yeah, the Treasury Building used to be the headquarters of Eastern Caribbean Currency Union stuff.
Interesting.
That all building in British now. That was the idea. So this song actually really encapsulates the anger that was just a general sentiment at the time in Trinidad and other Caribbean countries about what Jamaica did. Like, how dare you do this? Essentially, he's saying, how dare you do this? We planned this for years. We did all the things. Many people don't realize this.
Federation boiled down to simply this is dog eat dog and survival of the fittest. Everybody fighting for independence, singularly Trinidad for instance. We gon' get it too, so don't bother. But I find we should all be together, not separated as we are because of Jamaica. If they know they didn't want federation, and they know they don't want to unite as one. Tell the doctor you're not in favor. Don't behave like a blasted traitor. How the devil you mean you are federating no more? Outside man.
The current national anthem of Trinidad is the same music of the Federation anthem. They kept it.
Oh.
They kept it.
They were like, this song is fire. And it stayed. I love that.
We did this for a reason. We are not getting rid of this. We are keeping this. It was such a major sentiment in the Caribbean, generally speaking, to have a preference for the Federation.
Wasn't the University of the West Indies, wasn't that birthed from the Federation while they were in existence?
It was not, no.
Oh, it wasn't? Okay.
So the West Indies University, it started as a college of the University of London in Jamaica. And then just over time, as just general things are moving towards more independence, it became a full-fledged university. It's called the West Indies because just at the time, the entire Caribbean was called West Indies.
Oh, okay, I thought it was actually
No, it came before. Came before. So Akil, what are your thoughts on the song and the details and the sentiment of the song?
Again, another good song to be played in school for us to learn from.
Yes.
Because, I'm only learning most of this stuff now since I didn't do history, oddly enough, in school. Why is that? That is a whole different topic. That's another episode altogether. But I do love a lot of these little, would it be correct to call it nuances within the song, hinting at all the different ways the Federation fell down. And it's so weird and ironic because we're supposed to be all together, but for some reason we quickly fell apart. And that is still baffling today. Listening to the song, researching it, is still baffling how we agreed on this and then it fell apart so quickly. Is there anyone who wrote a book like why? Like how was it formed and then why it fell apart? Like why did Jamaica leave? How were they able to leave so easily?
There are many books. My humble opinion, I think none are actually really good at capturing really what happened in both pre and after. But in general, the Federation, while it had a lot of really big support sentimentality across the Caribbean, the construction of it was actually not good. It was not well done from a mechanical point of view. Where, for example, the Governor General of the Federation, who was Lord Hales, his name was, he had a lot of power. Almost like a early colonial general type power. There are many lines in the federal constitution that had things like at the discretion of general and so on. And that made for a very weak government. Also, many things in terms of the structure of the federal budgeting was not well prepared. A lot of things regarding to the civil service training was not well prepared. It was in many ways rushed, but not rushed in terms of they didn't have time. They didn't put in the amount of effort you would think they put in. But that's actually why the Governor General has so much power, in my view, where it was said, we are going to fix this over time. And we're going to get going, we're going to fix it over time. Because it is actually what is fixable. But for various reasons, the politicians in the Caribbean who were not the ones in the federal parliament, so this was like Bustamante in Jamaica, Sparrow in Barbados, for example, they had different viewpoints on many things. They actually preferred this full-on decolonization type thing. Oftentimes, when I speak to like older people who were actually alive in that time period, like, a lot of power hunger as well. So there are human reasons why things also fail as well.
So the Federation was agreed upon not by these same persons that left.
That's correct.
But that explains a lot. That explains a lot.
I feel like the Federation mirrors international law concerns in the sense that countries never want to give up their power. But what happens when countries don't want to give up their power is that institutions have no power at all. So in order for countries to agree to enter into these mass agreements, you really have to not interfere with their sovereignty. And the Federation, like how you're mentioning how much power the Governor General had, I feel the Federation is too far into, even though the countries didn't have sovereignty at the time, they still had some sense of identity. And whenever you're trying to take sovereignty from a country, it never goes well. And that's why it only works if you have pretend international laws, because, you know, everyone will always tell you that international law has no teeth. And I think CARICOM would be the successful version of the Federation. Would you agree?
It will be a successor version, but it's not successful at all.
Well, I mean, successful in the sense that it didn't close down in 4 years.
Well, the reason why it didn't close down, it has nothing to offer the world. That's why.
Like international law, no power changes hands. Everything is exactly the same. And we sit around together and we write our names on documents with no power. And countries are really protective of their sovereignties. And also the human problems. I think Caribbean people, we're really human people. We feel deeply in all elements of our work. And I think that really would have been an issue.
You see, you say that, and then I look at the Bronx in New York. Because some people point out correctly that the Bronx is the most Caribbean city on earth, because there are so many different Caribbean cultures just coexisting, carrying on as a Caribbean society. And people actually use that a lot more terms there in the actual Caribbean. And there's no structural reason why these things could have been surpassed. These like insular feelings and so on. They were stoked by politicians who wanted more power. Again, Brexit is a good example. We have many common nowadays examples of this also. It wasn't sound. It wasn't very credible. They played on these very insular feelings, but they were ill-managed. We could have succeeded. Australia's still there. Canada's still there. They have problems. And Canada had and has still its share of very difficult cultural problems, you know, especially the Quebecois movement and the actual main Canada. I know I'm get some heat for that. But it's still there. Things can be overcome with good leadership.
And you know what? That is hinted in the actual song when he referenced the pettiness almost.
Yes.
When he references how Jamaica did not appreciate that Trinidad was the capital. And then they did not appreciate that the premier of Barbados was placed as the head of the Federation. So he hinted in the song that is why Jamaica left and then Trinidad left. And if you listen to it, it kind of sounds a bit petty. It raises a couple questions on why that couldn't possibly have been the only reason.
When they didn't get the capital site, that nearly caused big fight. When Sir Grantley Adams took up his post, that even made things worse. They ballin', we ain't want no Bajan premier. Trinidad can't be capital for here. So the grumbling went on and on to a big referendum. But if they know they didn't want federation, and they know they don't want to unite as one and only one, I said to tell the doctor you're not in favor. Don't behave like a blasted traitor. How the devil you mean you're federating no more?
It was petty. I want to be clear that there were structural reasons that the Federation did need some tweaks and so on, but no one that voted really knew those reasons either. They had very petty reasons.
I'm not disagreeing with you all. I'm just poking in to say Jamaica and Trinidad would have been countries with the biggest financial obligations to the Federation. And I understand that, yes, some of the countries are a lot smaller and you have to divide the financing according to who can afford it. But I see why Jamaica would have been like, okay, so we're paying for all of this and also we can't even have the headquarters in our country. I think you have to give to get often. And I think that probably affected the situation and that things have to be handled delicately.
True, but Trinidad also paid a substantial amount as well.
And that's why they followed soon after.
They followed not because they wanted to end. They followed because if Jamaica would not be in the Federation, it would not work.
Why wouldn't it work?
Economics. It's still an economics question where the federal budget needs to be financed. So it's still a problem. So they didn't leave because it's unfair that we want to pay all the money, but they couldn't. And that's true, they couldn't. They needed to have Jamaica in it. Barbados also was a big chunk of the budget as well. We were a small country, but we were still a very high proportion in the Eastern Caribbean. So those kind of things play into power.
It makes sense that everything fell down behind it because I guess 1 from 10 really is not, because if you and a bunch of people are carrying a coach and somebody lets go, well, the coach is going to fall. And maybe Jamaica was petty, but maybe they could have been more delicate. Maybe they could have given Jamaica a bit more for footing so much of the bill. And then Trinidad, they made a choice that they had to make.
Yes, but a bit more of what, right? The capital is primarily a symbolic thing.
Exactly, which is why they should have been able to get it, because it means nothing. And that would have massaged the situation.
What you forget is that this only became an issue in the stoking of fears. It was not an issue when it actually started Federation. No one had an issue with it. So the people that were in Jamaica's table, when they went into the Federation, didn't have the issue of it being Trinidad. Mm-hmm. So it was never a problem until the people who actually wanted to get back the power were like, hey, you remember that capital cross-day in Trinidad? We should have it here. That's what started. It's the same kind of anti-politics you see now in the US and so on. So it's the same Trumpian mechanism, essentially. Populism is not new. It's old as time.
I guess my feeling on it is that it would have happened anyway. Somebody always wants more power. You have to get ahead of the situation. And perhaps they learned from that.
This is why I think a very good parallel will be the Pierre Trudeau Quebecois issue in Canada, where Pierre Trudeau was very forceful in many ways in dealing with the Quebecois issues. Yes, he conceded some things, but he was very, very forceful in other things. Unfortunately, I think if you run the counterfactual, if Pierre Trudeau was not the Prime Minister at the time, we probably wouldn't have Canada today. It's that simple, I think. It really does, and I think it's clear that Canada together makes more sense, even though some people don't, that there are these hard choices to make. Even if you were in the referendum that way, there are many ways to say, hey, this is not a good idea, guys. This is going to end badly. It has, I think, ended badly. And that's just the political issues. It wasn't managed properly. So many issues. I still think the impetus for it remains correct and remains acute. But the way how we have the conversation needs to change for sure. So I want to use this line from the song where he said, sorry, but no federation again. I think it's a big shame. After so much effort and energy, goodbye everybody. Right now it's only a memory. We failed miserably. Some may say we shouldn't have parted, but it's Jamaica who has started. If they know they didn't want federation and they know they didn't want to unite as one, just tell the doctor you're not in favor. Don't behave like a bastard traitor. This is no time to say you ain't federating no more. It's such angry sentiment. That to me properly, even when he sings it, he has that vigor in his voice. He really puts that thing together. And now, more than 50 years later, we are still having a conversation about these topics, but also it's gotten worse in many ways.
Sorry, but no federation again. I think it's a big shame. After so much efforts and energy put by everybody, right now it's only a memory. We fail miserably. Some may say we shouldn't help part it, but it's Jamaica where start it. If they know they didn't want federation, and they know they don't want to unite as one, Just tell the doctor you're not in favor. Don't behave like a blasted traitor. This is no time to say you are federating no more.
But you did speak how we within the region can start to go in the right direction. You have some tips and tricks, those right words to you to describe it, in your Substack called What Should a Caribbean Think Tank Do?
Yes, and that was the reason. And I'm not sure if I didn't make a public announcement of the think tank yet, have I? No. But if you're listening, so the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, or CPSI, has been formed. We're going to make some announcements later. But the logo of the think tank is actually inspired by the flag of the Federation. So it's abstracted. It's abstracted. That's the basis of it. And it's also a branding theme where we have developed. It's when the website is there. You can actually see it in this podcast image also. These color gradient. The yellow color gradient on the podcast image you're seeing now on Spotify or our podcast is actually a topographical structure based on the Caribbean countries' contour lines on the topology. So the colors are actually waved in as Caribbean countries. Again, it's very blown up, so you can't see it whole. If you shrink it down, you can see it actually from a Caribbean country's topology lines. And it's done that way also because of the idea of the concept in Caribbean literature called dialectics, which is mostly associated with a guy called Kamal Brathwaite, a Barbadian poet and author. And essentially about the whole, to make a very simple version of it, we are not separated by the ocean, we are connected by the ocean. And therefore, the tidal waves, even from Africa to the Caribbean, it's one ocean, it's one movement, it's one pathway. From the Caribbean to the western hemisphere, the US and Canada, all the oceans, all the tides, it's one pathway. Across the Caribbean Sea, it's one pathway. And also, in my view, one pathway to the future as well. And when you kind of put that in together, the dialectic version of the Caribbean is the correct kind of Caribbean, in my view. All that kind of weaves in there, essentially. But yeah, because I think these topics really have to get brought through more in the conversation on Caribbean growth and Caribbean policy. Federation, IMF policy, prudential problems, and even say governance criteria, governance failures in the first round. Those are the things that need to come up, and we don't usually talk about it that often.
But we're going to talk about it now a lot more often.
Exactly. Okay, so any concluding remarks from Kenidi or Akil about these songs we've had? Songs we've heard?
We should go around and call our favorite songs. Mine is Iley Take Over.
Okay.
IMF Take Over.
So just to not have the same favorite song as Akil, I'm going to choose Sinking Ship by Gypsy, but IMF Takeover is a very close second. It was a bop, but I'm going to pick Sinking Ship. How about you, Rasheed?
I am going to have to agree with Akil, unfortunately, because
really?
It is such a good song. Even the brass sections is just on. I
feel it. You feel it like in your body, like
you
it
feel
is.
in your body, yeah. Okay, thank you, Akil and Kenidi. This is our very first and maybe last, I don't know, maybe first of many conversations on Caribbean music and its insights into Caribbean political economy.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, it's been amazing.
Perfect.